With the release of the 3 Paldean starter Pokemon, Meowscarada, Skeledirge, and Quaquaval, there has been a shift of the mono ingredient meta, or the mono ingredient spread of Pokemon to take on each of the ingredient role. Welcome back to another Pokemon Sleep video. It's Brovinny here. Now, for those of you who are new to the channel, let me catch you up on what all of this means. So what is the mono ingredient list or the mono ingredient meta? Many months ago, I made a video that said if you could have just one ingredient list on your Pokemon, for example, Charizard having only sausage, sausage, sausage in its 3 ingredient slots, that would be ideal. And the reason is, in simple terms, you will always get the ingredient that you need when you need it. In mathematical terms, when you cook a recipe dish matching the recipe ingredients, you can get up to 300% recipe bonus. That means that each one ingredient that you put into the dish can be worth 4 times its base value. For example, a sausage being worth only 103 ingredient strength when you use it as an extra ingredient or not matching a recipe. But if you use it in Inferno Corn Keema Curry, the sausage that you put into the recipe is actually worth 4 times 103. So 4 times its base strength if it's at max level. So if your Charizard had sausage, ginger, sausage, and the ginger isn't needed, then you're not getting that 4 times value from having this Charizard on the team. Now, of course, you might argue that ginger can also be used in Inferno Corn Keema Curry, but the problem is you will almost never get the right ratio. Let's say you have a level 30 Charizard that has ginger at level 30. Well, the problem is you need more sausage than you do ginger. So to start with, we've got the ingredient list the wrong way around. But then you could argue that by level 60, then it will farm more sausage than ginger. Now, the ratio of sausage to ginger is 2:1. Now, you don't have to remember any of these numbers. This is just an example for me to show you why I very much prefer a mono ingredient list. So with a ratio of 2:1, let's take a look at Charizard. It will farm 7 sausage at level 60, 2 sausage at level 1, and 4 ginger at level 30. That means that on average, if I've got 3 productions, 1 of each, then I will have 2 plus 7, which is 9 sausages to 4 gingers. And that ratio is close, but isn't actually quite 2:1. So in that case, on average, you would overfarm sausages while you're hunting for the ginger. And depending on the Pokemon, the ingredient ratios keep changing, you having to work your Pokemon to match exact recipes when the game actually constantly changes. For example, Ninja Curry recently had a buff and had more beans added to the dish. Over time, you will not be able to keep up with the right ratio of ingredients within the same Pokemon, unless you use the mono ingredient strategy. And the reason that works is because you can just farm your 24 sausages, and if you overfarm a little bit, that's fine. You'll be coming back to use those sausages later anyway. Let's say you farm 26 sausages and you only need to use 24, then you rotate out the Charizard and you put in a Tyranitar. That will then farm you maybe 14, 15 gingers. You have a little bit of excess. Any excess ingredients then goes to the next Inferno Keema Curry. But you will never have an issue of waiting for one ingredient while over farming another, because in a mono ingredient build, you just swap out that Pokemon and use another one instead. And I hope that makes sense, because the mono ingredient build for your ingredient specialists will resist changes in the game, whether it be power creep or dish recipe changes or recipe ingredient numbers changing like Ninja Curry recently had. No matter what the game throws at you, you will be most resistant to any changes. Of course, some people will bring up that you'll have energy issues if you keep rotating your Pokemon. That's why it's very crucial for you to have a good healer or you know how to manage your naps properly. And to be honest, if it happens that you have to sleep with the Charizard after farming a whole day with it and it's on 0 energy, then so be it. So what you do is you farm your 24 or 48 sausages today. Tomorrow you change over to farm something else instead after you slept with Charizard and it's regained its energy. But in no situation am I farming something that I don't really need. Now Charizard happens to be a good example here because it hits 2 of the ingredients of Keema Curry. But if Ginger wasn't a needed ingredient, for example, what if you can't cook Keema Curry? You don't have your good cam ticket, you don't have your expand pot Pokemon, you're free to play, maybe you can only cook Ninja Curry. How are you going to get those 9 sausages if your Charizard has sausage, ginger, sausage when it's over farming gingers that you don't need, and they can only be used as extra pot fillers that aren't worth 4 times what they should be if you match the recipe. To me, the extra ingredients should be ingredients that your berry or skill specialists are farming. And the reason that is because they have other things they need to do. They need to match the favorite berry of the island. They need to be healing or expand potting. You don't have time to worry about what ingredients they give you. If they happen to give you what you need for the dish, that's great. But if they don't, that's where your extra ingredients will come to fill up the pot. Hopefully not from your ingredient specialist. Your ingredient specialist should be focused on giving you only what you need to complete a recipe. And so that is the basis behind the mono ingredient spread. Why spread? Well, what we try to do is not have Pokemon overlap on roles, because it becomes really costly for you to invest the same Pokemon to do several different roles. For example, Victreebel is excellent at tomatoes, but before the Paldean starters came in, it was your best option for potato as well. You could theoretically have one Victreebel for potato and one for tomato, but in terms of resources, the idea behind this spread is to avoid overlaps. Now, I'm not saying you can't overlap. In fact, in some cases, like Blastoise, he kind of has to take on 2 roles. Just because in the base rate, Toxicroak does the most oil doesn't mean that you only have to use Toxicroak. You could have a Cramorant that does oil as well. This graphic is just to give you an idea of, well, what your end goal should be if your focus is only to farm ingredients. Some people like Cramorant's skill, so maybe there's an argument for Cramorant to farm oil. Heck, you could even have Ditto to do oil. Ditto can do oil, tail. So at level 1 and level 30, it can have oil if it doesn't have leak. So it can be part of your mono ingredient spread. This graphic doesn't actually mean that Pokemon is definitely the best at that ingredient. It often happens to be the best, but if we were to take Dragonite for example, Dragonite having herb, corn, quite often matches, if not beats, Beware for corn farming, even if Beware has mono corn. But if you were to use Dragonite for corn farming, you're in trouble for herb farming. You won't be able to have enough herbs to cook Keema Corn Curry. Unless maybe you have Gengar do herbs instead, but then you'll have nobody for mushrooms at this stage of the game. Which is why this list here suggests that Dragonite should be mono herb because pretty much no one else can do it. So it should focus on doing the thing that no one else can. Could you have a secondary Dragonite that does corn instead? Well, you could. But then any stuff or candies that you farm will just be excess candies. You won't be using a Beware at all if you've got a Dragonite for herbs and a Dragonite for corn. Not to mention how expensive investing in a Dragonite is. And to have 2 of them means that you're not very future-proof if you're trying to unlock level 60 ingredient or level 75 subskill in the future. So this list is very carefully crafted to give you guys an end goal in mind on what Pokemon should be doing what to avoid overlaps, at the same time giving the best ingredient specialist in that role without having a Pokemon clash on ingredients. So you won't see any overlaps in which Pokemon doing what. There are some honorary mentions at the bottom here, depending on the situation that you're in. And we will go through this all over again, of how each ingredient specialist got their role. So how do we actually come to this spread? Well, it all started with Ditto because it is the only ingredient specialist that does tails. Granted, it only does it at level 60. Right now, based on current rates though, Slowbro is actually better at farming tails than Ditto. Heck, you could even argue Vaporeon can farm more tails than Ditto. But we haven't yet unlocked level 60, and this graphic is really just to focus on ingredient specialists, not skill specialists. So that's why Ditto is on the top of the list here. Should level 60 be released and the ingredient rates get shifted and rebalanced, there is a chance that Ditto can be the main tail farmer once again. Regardless, that's why we'll put Ditto in the tails slot. Now, Ditto also can do oil or leak, but we're not going to have Ditto do all three roles. It's not great at them anyway. The best oil farmer is Toxicroak. The alternative is Cramorant, which is mentioned here. So if you have a mono oil Cramorant, that's fine as well. As for leak, currently the best leak farmer is actually Dugtrio. That's because at level 30, Dugtrio is still at the top of the leak farming. The reason we have Quaquaval here, and we'll come to this towards the end of the video, is because at level 60, Quaquaval will then overtake in leak farming. But until level 60 gets unlocked, you may want to use Dugtrio as your leak farmer instead. Now, if Quaquaval does leak, that means that you may not want to have another Quaquaval for beans. In fact, Golem is still the best at farming beans, so there's no need to have Quaquaval do beans as well. Unless you happen to have a really good one, but then Golem will be kind of out of a job because the other ingredient that it can farm, potato, has now been overtaken completely by Meowscarada. Meowscarada does the most potatoes of all ingredient specialists, and that's because at level 1, it does potatoes, whereas no one else can farm potatoes at level 1. Now, Meowscarada can do milk at level 30, but you wouldn't want it to. You would want it to focus on farming potatoes. That leaves Blastoise to focus on doing milks. And a mono milk Blastoise is significantly better than a potato milk Meowscarada. Then we have a problem, because we'll need to find a cacao farmer. And cacao farmers are very hard to come by, with Absol being the only one that can do mono cacao. Now, Absol's available at Snowdrop, but it's quite rare, very expensive to catch, and the chance of you getting mono cacao is only 1 in 9. So that means every 9 Absol you farm, you might have a chance to get 1 mono cacao Absol. And that's a very expensive long-term hunt. And by the time you do find one, maybe the best cacao farmer has changed, which is why Blastoise has a problem of needing to do 2 roles at once. And it's always been mentioned that Blastoise would alternatively also farm cacao. So you've got a few choices. One is you have a mono milk Blastoise, which is my recommendation, and then you have a secondary milk cacao Blastoise. If you prefer not to have 2 Blastoise to invest in, my recommendation would be milk cacao milk Blastoise, so that at level 60, it still focuses on milk. Then you should supplement that cacao with berry or skill specialists who can do cacao, like Meganium, for example. Or maybe have the Nightcap Pikachu supplement your cacao. But if you did happen to find a really good mono cacao Absol, then you now need to find someone for apples, because before the Paldeans came along, apples did not appear at level 1 for ingredient specialists. At the time, we had to choose between Pinsir or Absol or Delibird to do apples, but Delibird really needs to focus on eggs because there aren't many egg farmers either. And with Absol focusing on cacao, that really just left Pinsir to do apples at level 30 and 60. Thankfully, Fuecoco has come along and completely overtaken the role of doing apples. It is the best apple farmer to date. Just make sure it is mono apple. It is apple, apple, apple for all 3 ingredients. Because if it isn't, if it's apple, sausage, apple, that amount of apple is worse than a pincer that does honey, apple, apple. Because the level 30 and level 60 slots drop more in numbers than the level 1 slot. And definitely don't have a Fuecoco that does apple, sausage, sausage, because sausage should be covered by Charizard. Charizard is, to date, the only ingredient specialist that can do mono sausage. But of course, then you have to find a ginger farmer, and thankfully, Tyranitar is amazing at farming ginger. So you should find a Larvitar that's mono ginger. And if Tyranitar does ginger, then that means Golem needs to do beans. And that just leaves us with a few ingredients remaining. Venusaur should focus on doing mono honey because, well, other than Pinsir, which is very hard to farm, no one else can do mono honey. So I would highly recommend that any Bulbasaur that you invest is honey, honey, honey. The level 30 alternative ingredient would be tomato. Now, tomato has a lot of options. You could have a mono tomato, Victreebel, you could have Dugtrio, you could have Abomasnow. It depends on how you're going with the rest of the ingredient coverage. Now, because there are so many possibilities for tomato, and I forgot to mention Mr. Mime as well, it should actually be the last ingredient that you worry about. Now, Victreebel is actually the best mono tomato farmer if we consider that its main skill actually boosts its own tomato farming. Some may argue that Abomasnow is the best tomato farmer, but that ignores the fact that Abomasnow, its main skill isn't self-healing, so it doesn't help itself to farm more tomatoes. So at 71 tomatoes, compared to the 70 tomatoes of Victreebel, if you now consider that Victreebel can actually heal itself, and you turn off healing in the settings of the calculator, you will see that Victreebel, with now 65 tomatoes, actually beats Abomasnow in tomato farming. Of course, you could have a healer on the team to help compensate for that, which is why the top pick for tomato farming is actually Victreebel. But there's a second reason. The second reason is Abomasnow needs to do eggs. I don't expect many people to farm a perfect Delibird very early on. So you will need a Snover that does eggs at level 30 and 60. Otherwise, you might not have any egg farmers for a long time. But you can see that alternative tomato farmers include Mr. Mime and Abomasnow. Mr. Mime is actually number 3 in the tomato farming, if we were to also compare to Dugtrio and even Venusaur. So if you don't have a good Victreebel that does mono tomatoes, Mr. Mime is a fair alternative. Gengar is the only one that can do mushrooms at level 30 and 60, so it should just be the mushroom farmer and allow Dragonite to solely focus on doing herbs. And therefore Bewear can take on the role of doing mono corn. There's also not going to be a problem where you want corn and accidentally farm some herbs in Dragonite's case if we were to do a mixed ingredient list. And the funny thing about mixed ingredient lists, if you have a mixed ingredient list for a Dragonite, some days you might get more herbs, some days you might get more corn, but almost all days you just want to focus on one. Perhaps in an ideal world, you could have one of every ingredient possibility for every single ingredient specialist. For example, you could have herb corn Dragonite and herb Dragonite, and also herb corn Dragonite, and maybe herb oil Dragonite. You have just one of every list. But we're talking about very unrealistic outcomes here, especially looking at the rate of change in this game. It's just not going to be worth you trying to invest multiple of the same species unless there's a really good reason, like Blastoise. And while we're on that point, if you happen to have a Cacao-focused Blastoise, you could consider having Sprigatito do Milk at level 30 and 60. So that's why you can see that Meowscarada is an alternative milk farmer, but then it gets a bit messy because you need to go back to having a potato farmer that isn't Meowscarada. For example, Victreebel. Now, a lot of long-term players would have already invested in a Victory Bell that focuses on potatoes, so that might not be a problem. Because if you get enough potatoes from your Victory Bell and you do get a bit of tomato wastage, at least you can still have milk coverage from your Meowscarada. That is actually not my recommendation to try and balance your team building. I would still prefer to restart the build because each time a new thing gets released, it gets messier how you need to shift your ingredient roles around. And instead of having Meowscarada and Blastoise both being a bit average at their roles, I would rather Meowscarada just be excellent at potatoes so I can spend more time dealing with the problems that Blastoise has. Maybe spend more time farming candies or have berry specialist covered cacao, because the better your ingredient specialist, the less time you'll spend on your team. You'll be rotating it out once you've completed your recipe and just have berry specialists or other specialties in its place. In fact, a good measure for how good your ingredient specialist is how quick it can rotate out of the team. Other honorary mentions, we got Comfey who can do mono corn if you never found a good Beware, or maybe you're in the early stage of the game where you haven't unlocked Lakeside, then your only option is Comfey. Kangaskhan seems to make it into the alternative list all the time, but I so rarely see Kangaskhan, I don't see it as a realistic farmer for anything at all. It's just here in case you really want an alternative ginger farmer because you messed up your Tyranitar early on. I myself have a Tyranitar that does beans at level 30. But again, a 1 in 9 chance to get a mono ginger Kangaskhan when it's already very rare to spawn, it's not really realistic. Thankfully, the solution to that is to just find another Larvitar that actually does mono ginger and restart your investment. So this is how the ingredient meta has changed. Compare this to our previous graphic, which looks something like this, and it didn't have any of the Paldean starters. Mr. Mime had to take onto Tomato Roll because Potato was covered by Victory Bell. We didn't have level 1 apple farmers, so we had to rely on the likes of Pinsir or Absol, but then Absol had to do Cacao, so really it was just Pinsir. The reason why Pinsir is not on this graphic is because Pinsir only became better at apple farming after a rebalance in the game. And Dugtrio actually still belongs in this list at level 30 up until level 60, which we'll take a look at in a moment. Delibird no longer appears in the new graphic for apples. That's because we've decided that Delibird has a more important role. It has a more unique role, farming eggs at base level. Plus, Pinsir is just a bit better at farming apples anyway if you don't have a Fuecoco. But to be honest, I don't think there should be alternatives for apple farming. It should just be purely Fuecoco. The reason why we've left it here is that some long-term players have already invested in one of these apple farmers. So then maybe they don't really need to hunt a Fuecoco unless they want an improvement on their apple coverage. Now, let's take a look at the ingredient rate of the 3 new Paldean starters. Remember that the ingredient rate itself isn't enough to determine whether a Pokemon is good at farming that ingredient. It depends on several factors. First, we need to look at the frequency of the Pokemon or how fast it actually helps. We need to look at the ingredient rate, which represents the chance of an ingredient batch being dropped. And then we need to look at the number of ingredients that it farms at each ingredient slot. Now, level 60 hasn't been released, but the assumption is that each ingredient slot has a 1/3 chance of dropping. So it's the combination of these 3 factors, and sometimes the main skill, for example, Charge Energy, the self-healing skill, will boost that Pokemon's ability to keep farming that ingredient. It's the combination of these 3 to 4 factors that will ultimately determine how many of that ingredient that Pokemon will farm. And of course, just looking at these numbers by themselves isn't enough to tell us anything unless we compare them to their competitors. So let's start with the simple one, Skeledirge. I'm comparing Skeledirge to the ingredient specialist that came before it that farms apples. And we're assuming that level 60 will be exactly how we predict it to be, so there's a 1/3 chance of each of the slot of ingredients to be dropped. That could change, but let's assume that that's the case. And if we have Mono Apple for Skeledirge and compare it to Apple at level 30 and 60, Absol, Delibird, and Pinsir, you can see that even ignoring the self-healing ability, Skeledirge farms significantly more apples than all of its competitors. Now, I've got healing on max right now, so if I remove healing and actually consider that its main skill will self-heal the Skeledirge, it relatively farms even more apples. So Skeledirge is crazy for the amount of apples that it can farm. But that all changes if you accept the second best ingredient list for Skeledirge. And this is one of the problems of mixed ingredient lists, is that let's say it's a dessert week and you don't need sausages, you need those apples, and it's level 60. Now you can see that a Skeledirge that's apple, sausage, apple farms just about the same as all the other apple ingredient specialists. And that's with its self-healing. So if we remove the effects of self-healing and give everyone perfect healing, it actually farms less apples. So Skeledirge with an ingredient list of apple, sausage, apple is actually worse than any existing apple farmer that you might have, let's say a Pinsir, level 30, 60 apples, and it's really just not worth raising any Skeledirge that isn't mono apple. If you had one that has crazy good sub skills, and I mean top tier, perfect sub skills in nature, then maybe I would argue that's acceptable. You'd have to look at the numbers, but even then, just be aware that some days that Skeledirge might give you way too much sausage when you don't need the other ingredient. Because these numbers are averages. Some days you're just going to get more of certain ingredients than others. Just to complete this analysis, how does Skeledirge, if it theoretically has apple, sausage, how does it compare to our main sausage farmers? Well, let's take a look. Once again, I've got maximum healing on, and Skeledirge is the worst of the current sausage farmers. It's worse than both Bewear and Charizard. But of course, Bewear should just focus on corn, so I definitely wouldn't use Skeledirge for sausage farming when Charizard can get the job done and quicker. Next, let's take a look at potato farming. With Meowscarada's release, the first ingredient specialist to ever have potato at level 1, in fact the first of all specialties to ever get potato at base, it's almost predictable that it would be the best potato farmer. But let's have a look at the numbers anyway. Now, before Meowscarada actually came along, Golem was the best potato farmer. The reason we had Victreebel do potato was because someone had to do the beans role, and there was nobody else to do beans at the time. You could choose Quaquaval, which we'll come to in a moment, if you happen to have invested in a potato golem. But regardless of whether you went with Golem or Victreebel, at level 60, at level 30 or level 60, Meowscarada just beats all of them in the amount of potatoes that it farms. And it doesn't have the randomness of sometimes farming beans or tomatoes that you don't actually need. Some other alternatives are Kangaskhan, Cramorant, and Mr. Mime, but none of them are nearly as good as these three for potatoes. With Meowscarada being significantly better, we're talking about approximately 20% better for potato farming. Because of how much more potatoes Meowscarada can farm, I'm really questioning whether it's actually worth having Meowscarada with Milk, because let's compare Milk Blastoise and Milk Meowscarada. Milk Blastoise does easily 20-30% more milk than Meowscarada. So while I understand the sentiment of wanting a Meowscarada that farms milk to complement a Blastoise that focuses on cacao, it numerically just doesn't make much sense. I would much rather have a mono milk Blastoise that is just amazing at its job, a mono potato Meowscarada that's amazing at its job, and deal with a cacao problem. Really spend those days hunting for a cacao Absol, or find berry specialists or other specialties to help you with the cacao problem. Or just avoid cacao dishes, or have a secondary Blastoise, maybe just keep it at level 30 that does cacao at level 30. Until one day, maybe we'll have a better cacao farmer. So if my previous explanation on the graphic wasn't enough to convince you, I'm hoping these numbers convince you that it's probably still not a good idea to do mixed ingredient list, even as a way just to complement what you actually have right now, but rather just go for that mono ingredient build, that milk Blastoise and the potato Meowscarada. Now we mentioned Golem for beans, so let's take a look at Golem versus Quaquaval. Now this is going to be interesting because Quaquaval completely overlaps with Golem in the beans farming. They both do base level beans and level 30-60 beans. Golem does 2, 5, and 7 drops for beans. Quaquaval also does 2, 5, and 7. So it all comes down to their ingredient rate, which we know Golem has a really good ingredient rate, and their speed in combination. So let's take a look. Now Golem at both level 30 or level 60 beats Quaquaval just very slightly on beans. So if you happen to have an amazing mono bean Quaquaval, I wouldn't be upset. But if I had to choose, I would choose Golem for the beans farming. And that's more to do with what's going to happen with Dugtrio in a moment. But while we're here, let's take a look at the other beans option, Tyranitar. Tyranitar can self-heal, which once again means that it will farm more of the ingredients. But in this comparison, I've got everyone at max healing. Now, even with max healing on Golem and Quaquaval, Tyranitar actually does the most beans. So it's one of those situations where actually Golem is not the best for beans, but we still choose Golem to be the beans farmer, so that frees up Tyranitar to do something more unique, to be a ginger farmer instead. And also, you're going to have to deal with some randomness if you have a beans Tyranitar, because sometimes you're going to be getting ginger when you really just want beans. So there's still a good argument to maintain that Golem is the beans farmer, even when Tyranitar is a better farmer overall. Now, leak is the most interesting of all the changes, and that's because it depends on the level which we're comparing. Quaquaval, as many of you have noticed, only farms 2 leaks at level 30 and then 4 leaks at level 60, whereas Dugtrio, the previous leak farmer, does 3 leaks at level 30 and 4 leaks at level 60, so there's a change at the level 30 mark. Now, of course, it all comes down to, again, the combination of speed and ingredient rate, whether that actually makes a difference. So at level 60, Dugtrio farms significantly less leaks than Quaquaval. Granted that leaks are very hard to farm, so they both don't farm very much of them, but Quaquaval is better at farming leaks. But if we were to set it to level 30 only, then Quaquaval is actually worse at leaks than Dugtrio. Not by much, but it is worse. So there's a good argument to maintain using a Dugtrio for leaks until you can actually reach level 60. And I imagine level 60 is quite a while away for a lot of players. So there's no harm in looking for a Diglett that's double leaks early on in the game. Now I've also got Victreebel and Ditto here just for comparison, and we'll set them all to level 60 again. And Ditto farms even less leaks than all the other options. Victreebel, of course, having leak only at level 60, doesn't even match Ditto in the amount of leaks that it farms. When you have a full mixed ingredient list like this, we've got tomato, potato, and leek, you're gonna have a tough time finding a dish that matches the right ratio of the ingredients that Victreebel can farm. Another reason why mono ingredient is just generally better and easier to use. So the conclusion is back to this graphic. Skeledirge do mono apples, Meowscarada should do mono potatoes, Quaquaval long term should be looking at doing leek, but in the meantime, until you can actually reach level 60, you can use Dugtrio as your leek farmer. You don't have to hunt both, you can just choose whichever one that it has the better stats and is worth actually raising. It's just that Dugtrio hasn't actually been removed completely from the meta. So if we've got Meowscarada doing potato, well, where does that leave us with Victreebel? And that is where we'll look at the tomato farming. Comparing all mono tomato farmers, Victreebel is at the top if we consider the charge energy as an ability to keep that tomato farming at a higher level. So that marks all the changes to the mono ingredient specialists from this update. But one thing we haven't touched on in this video is the skills that came with the ingredient specialist. We do know that for Coco, it'll farm even more apples because of its self-healing. But what about Meowscarada and Quaquaval? And how about their skill rates compared to other similar Pokemon? Let's start with Skeledirge, and I've got a list of a bunch of different charge energy Pokemon, so the self-healing Pokemon here, and I'm going to put in no sleeping at all and see how many skill triggers a day each of these Pokemon can do. Skeledirge does 4.8 triggers based on my simulation every day, which, if we exclude Umbreon, is the highest of all current Pokemon that do charge energy S. I mean, look at Raticate, it's only 2 a day. 3 for Arbok, 3 for Victreebel, 2 for Dodrio, 3 for Marowak, 2 for Dragonite, 4 for Tyranitar, which was the previous best at Charge Energy S, excluding Skill Specialist. Well, the current best self-healer, besides Umbreon, which hopefully nobody uses, is Skeledirge, which has almost 5 triggers in a day, based on my simulation. Of course, this assumes that you collect the skills over 24 hours constantly. So if you're looking at 12 hours in a day, you just halve that. So you're looking at about 2.5 triggers in a day. Umbreon's a special case. It just keeps self-healing. You can go up to 10 triggers in a day if you keep collecting over 24 hours, which we've talked about in the Evolutions guide, and we're not going to cover that here again. But basically, it's pretty useless because it just heals, but it doesn't farm what you need it to farm. So I guess that was quite interesting that Skeledirge even beats Tyranitar, the pseudo-legendary, at self-healing. So Skeledirge really wouldn't need an Energy for Everyone healer on the team. Next is the Expand Pot Specialists. Now, Cooking Power Up S belonged solely to Skill Specialists before Meowscarada's release. So it's not really a fair comparison to compare an Ingredient Specialist to a Skill Specialist, but we generally say Skill Specialists have about 2 times the trigger rate of other specialties in their main skill. So if we look at it that way, well, Meowscarada is just under half of the skill triggers of the Expand Pot Specialists. So nothing too crazy here. Some people say it makes sense for an Ingredient Specialist to have Cooking Power Up, but to me, you should only have Cooking Power Up to help you cook the next best recipe if you're free to play. If you're pay to play, if you've got Good Camp Ticket running all the time, you don't really need Cooking Power Up, because anything you put into the extra pot size is just extra ingredient anyway. That doesn't include the Expand Pot strategy on Sunday night, where you can stack a heap of Slowpoke tails for Monday morning, but that's a topic we've covered in another video. So to me personally, that's a pretty useless skill because I've got Good Camp Ticket running all the time. For everyone else, it's nice to be able to cook that next dish every now and then. But you could just rotate between a Cooking Power Up Specialist and an Ingredient Specialist who's doing their job properly. Because if you have Mono Potato Meowscarada and you're relying on its Cooking Power Up when you don't need potatoes, then you're in trouble. So I'd say that you still need a Cooking Power Up Specialist if that's what you plan to do. You plan to cook a stronger recipe. As for Quaquaval, it's actually quite similar to Meowscarada, is that it's the first of its kind to have Charge Strength M that isn't a skill specialist. And it does farm approximately half the amount of Charge Strength than the other skill specialists of the same skill. The thing about Charge Strength M though, is that it has less conditions for it to be good. Every time it triggers, it simply powers up your Snorlax, whereas Cooking Power Up depends on whether you actually need to cook that next higher pot size recipe, or if everything is just extra ingredients. So I do like that it's simple to use, but once it's done farming beans or leeks, it should be heading back into the box anyway. So there's really not too much to talk about here. If you're thinking about whether to spend your main skill seeds on these Pokemon, I'd say it's really not worth it, because you should be using them on your skill specialists instead. Because if it's strength you're after, you'll end up having way too many beans or leeks for no reason. So who am I personally hunting first? Well, I actually have an apple problem, so my priority is Fuecoco, followed by Leek for Quaxly, because my duck trio just isn't very good. I do have a Leek Ditto, but eventually I'll need to switch to a Tails Ditto. Then I'll be looking for a Meowscarada with triple potato. I currently have an excellent double potato Victreebel, so I'm not in a rush to hunt Meowscarada. By the way, if you're using the Nerf spreadsheet, this is what the new ingredient options look like for each of the ingredients. It's pretty much just the same thing as the Banana Tanks graphic. It's just that this one you can modify yourself. I'll be posting this graphic under quick guides. I'll be posting the new mono ingredient spread under quick guides in my Discord after this video is released. And a special shout out to Banana Tanks, who's been making these graphics for us. You can see here that I'm mostly missing apple farming. I don't even have one single ingredient specialist that does apples. I will be putting Victreebel down to the second slot and have Meowscarada in the first slot for focused potato farming. My Leek Ditto will be moving to the second slot in preference for Quaquaval to take a primary slot for Leek farming. Let me know if you guys have any questions in the comments section below, and good luck to your Paldean hunting.